Hi everybody. In recent weeks, China allegedly rammed and sank a Vietnamese fishing boat, aimed a fire control radar at a Philippine Navy corvette, established new administrative districts to govern disputed territories in the South China Sea, and sent a survey ship near the coast of North Borneo in an apparent challenge to Malaysian oil and gas exploration. Are all these incidents connected? What exactly is going on in the South China Sea? I am Jeffrey Ordaniel, and this is Maritime Discussion Series number 3. For this session, we're going to focus on the recent tension over resource survey activities off the coast of the Malaysian state of Sarawak, where a Malaysian drill ship was being tailed apparently to intimidate it by a Chinese survey vessel. The United States dispatched USS America, a small carrier equipped with several F-35 jets, helicopters, and personnel from the US Marines. But the US attempt to reassure Southeast Asia was not necessarily welcomed by the Malaysian government, or at least that's the impression of many analysts here in Asia. To help us go beyond the headlines and understand this complex issue, we will be joined by two distinguished experts from both sides of the Pacific. First, from Washington, D.C., is one of America's leading authorities on maritime security in the Indo-Pacific, Gregory B. He is the director of the Asia Maritime Transparency Initiative and senior fellow at the Southeast Asia Program, both under the Center for Strategic and International Studies, or CSIS. Joining him from Kuala Lumpur is Captain Martin Sebastian of Maritime Institute of Malaysia, who will give us the Malaysian and perhaps the Southeast Asian perspective on what exactly is going on and what countries in the region, including the United States, should do about it. Our speakers will be given about 10 to 15 minutes each, and then we will open the session to feedback and Q&A. So first, let's hear from AMTI Director Greg Poling from Washington, D.C. Greg, good evening to you there, and thanks for joining us.
Thank you again, Jeff, and thanks for everybody for joining again. I know that there's a lot of topics of interest going around, and it's good to see that maritime security is not falling completely off the radar. One of the interesting points of discussion lately here in Washington, and I think increasingly in the region, is this narrative about whether or not China is using the COVID-19 pandemic, and in particular Southeast Asian distraction as states struggle to mitigate the outbreak, if that's being used by Beijing to increase its assertive actions in the South China Sea, in a sense, taking advantage of the pandemic, as the Secretary of State here has said. And of course, the ongoing standoff off Sarawak is a big part of that, as you mentioned, the sinking of the Vietnamese fishing vessel in the Paracels, and a whole host of administrative declarations and very strong words out of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And my takeaway, and I think what we see off the coast of Sarawak, is that really China hasn't changed much on the water. Activities that we're seeing today are more or less identical to what Beijing was doing 6 months ago. The current operation off Sarawak is largely the same script that we saw play out for 4 months off the coast of Vietnam last year. Those actions, the business as usual, does seem more outrageous to a lot of people, given the current status of the outbreak and the need for Southeast Asia to deal with it. And certainly it makes folks in certain capitals quite angry, because they already believe that China has a certain amount of blame to bear for the early response to the pandemic. It also, I think, has been made worse by the reactions of the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs in particular, who have become extremely sensitive to any criticism at this time. And so just as they are reacting with chest-thumping nationalism to any criticism about the pandemic, they're also reacting very harshly to any criticism, especially by the Vietnamese and also from Manila, to its actions in the South China Sea. And that creates this escalatory cycle, shouting back and forth. So what I'd like to do for the rest of my presentation is run through a little bit of the work that we've done at AMTI on what exactly is going on off the coast of Malaysia, and why I say that it's not really all that different than what we've seen in the past. There we go. So, one thing that's become quite clear over the last 2.5 years or so is that Beijing has decided that it now has the capability to prevent any new oil and gas drilling or any new oil and gas exploration anywhere in the South China Sea in a way that was impossible a few years ago, before the completion of the infrastructure in the Spratly Islands that now permits constant Chinese Coast Guard patrols and constant Chinese militia patrols through every inch of the 9-dash line. Chinese objections to oil and gas exploration off the coast of Malaysia were largely theoretical, right? Beijing would complain, but it was pretty rare to see a Chinese Coast Guard ship spending any significant amount of time off Malaysia. That started to change in 2013 and 2014 with the persistent patrols around Luconia Shoals, but it's really taken off since about 2017. And the same's playing out off Vietnam, where places like Vanguard Bank and the Rosneft operations there in the Nam Can San Basin have come in for much more persistent harassment. And so one thing that we've noticed is that with the completion of the harbors, the China Coast Guard, all major platforms in China Coast Guard are deployed 24/7. And where they spend most of their time when they're not in harbor at Subi or Mischief Reef is around a handful of features that have become very symbolically important to Beijing. One of those is Scarborough Shoal, another is Second Thomas Shoal, where the Sierra Madre is grounded, but the third is Luconia. And the frequency, the lengths of deployments at Luconia has increased steadily. And it's those patrols around Luconia that are being seconded to do things like harass the West Capella. So the initial harassment of the West Capella started with the CCG ship that's on the regular patrol at Luconia and was only then reinforced. The oil and gas harassment took a turn last year, and it's not just in Block 6-1, which is the Rosneft drilling operation that made the international press. It really started off the coast of Malaysia. Last May, we had Shell Sarawak, a Royal Dutch Shell affiliate in Sarawak, drilling a new exploration well in Block SK308, the small purple one you see on your screen, when the regular Luconia Shoals patrolling Coast Guard ship, the 35111, peeled off and spent about 2 weeks harassing the Malaysian operation. This is the first time we at ANTI got a really good look into what the playbook is for these kinds of operations, because the Chinese tend to avoid harassing the rig or the drilling ship itself. That's very dangerous. It's probably not going to be effective. Instead, what they do is they harass the offshore supply vessels, the small civilian boats that keep a rig running. And that went on consistently. What you're seeing here is a pretty standard track of the AIS signals that we saw day in and day out. When the Malaysians didn't back down, the same Chinese Coast Guard ship, 35111, headed across the South China Sea and started the exact same operation against the Rosneft operation, in which Rosneft had contracted the Hakoryu 5, a Japanese rig. And that went on again for several weeks, the exact same kind of basically high seas chicken. And when the Russians didn't back down and the Vietnamese didn't back down, the Chinese decided to escalate horizontally. This was the first time that we saw this kind of use, this weaponization of a survey vessel. The Haiyang D-Drake gets called out, and it spends the next 4 months surveying up and down the Vietnamese coast, tailed by its own escorts, and then the Vietnamese trying to get in the way. At the height of the operation, if you believe Hanoi's numbers, Vietnam had deployed about 50 Coast Guard ships and militia ships, and the Chinese had about 40 out there. And I think everybody was pretty lucky that nobody bumped into each other. We could have very easily had an incident in this. Things got a little quiet, and then by middle of December, we start seeing the same harassment breaking out off Malaysia. And it's not just around the current site of the West Capella drilling. This actually started in Block ND4 there with the West Capella back in December, in which several Chinese Coast Guard ships, who were actually busy escorting fishermen, the fishermen that later showed up off the coast of Indonesia, peeled off to harass some of the West Capella's drilling. They then went down and bothered Shell again, and then they peeled back up into Block ND1 and ND2 there, the Arapaima and Lala fields, as the Malaysians call them, which is where this really got escalated. It really made the press, partially because it's so far out. It was quite provocative, partially because it overlaps with the joint defined area, and so it roped in the Vietnamese, and partially because of the sheer numbers. The Chinese started deploying more and more and more Coast Guard ships. And this again went on for several months. I'm actually surprised that it took the Chinese this long to decide to escalate. The shot here you see is the game of chicken we saw every single day from late December until end of March. The two fishing vessels are actually Vietnamese fishing vessels that are warning away the West Capella. And of course, the Haijing 5305 is a Chinese Coast Guard ship. And then when Malaysia didn't back down, just like when Vietnam didn't back down, the Haiyang D-Drake gets called out in early April. Comes out with its escorts, about half a dozen Coast Guard ships and probably a dozen or so militia ships, so it's hard to get the exact number, and begins a survey up and down the coast. So this is something we've seen before. And like the Vietnam operation, what I expect is going to happen is that the West Capella's drilling will end this month, most likely. It was contracted, as I understand it, to drill 4 wells, 2 in ND1, 2 in ND2. It's finished 3 of them. It's only under contract from the UK company Seadrill through May. Presumably it will finish up its drilling. Petronas will say mission accomplished and go home. The Chinese will say mission accomplished and go home and pull the high NVG rate out. And like Rosneft, they will never come back. Petronas will never come and tap this well. And so it might be a tactical victory of Malaysia standing up, but the new normal that this shows is that China's Coast Guard presence in the southern reaches of the 9-dash line are effectively making it impossible for commercial operations. It is too risky, too dangerous, too expensive for commercial operators to invest in these blocks, and it's far too difficult for Southeast Asian states to protect them, right? You cannot call out your entire Coast Guard every single time you want to drill for oil and gas. That's the new reality. And what I expect is that in a couple of years, we're all going to realize that it has become impossible for anyone other than CNOOC to drill in the southern reaches of the South China Sea. And I'll wrap there. That's my big depressing takeaway of where we stand.
Thanks, Greg. Martin, go ahead, please.
Thank you. Before I start, selamat pagi and a very good morning from Kuala Lumpur. I'd like to thank YCAPS for the webinar, and especially my friend John Bradford and Greg Poling for putting these things together. I represent myself today and not MIMA or the government. I shall attempt to explain the unfolding events, and please bear with me and be fair with me when you shoot me later with the questions. Okay, so I'll approach this situation in three aspects. The first of all, the first aspect is that the pandemic that is raging around the world, it has a number of threats that has come to Malaysia. Number one, saving lives and livelihood. Whilst at sea, we talk about sovereignty and sovereign rights, but the more important issue during this pandemic is lives and livelihood. So the government actually focused, number one, on the movement restriction, and number two, the government had other threats with undocumented and documented migrants, and also the influx of migrants through the Andaman and through the Straits of Malacca. So back home, the movement restriction order initially was being policed by the law enforcement agencies, but it was not successful. So later we had to bring in the military to enforce the movement restriction. And of course, that was unpopular. Just like what is happening in South China Sea, the decisions by the government seem unpopular, but as the topic of my presentation today, it's balancing priorities and weighing options. So in balancing priorities and weighing options, the government had to do what is necessary. So here we are looking at saving lives and deploying the military and the law enforcement, mostly at the closing of borders in the west part of the peninsula, and also in Sulu Sea. As we know, most of you know, that we don't only have the South China Sea, we also have the Straits of Malacca, the South China Sea, and the Sulu Sea. It's a big responsibility. For us, on the second part, where I go to South China Sea is important. And Malaysia, as what the Foreign Minister mentioned, has been very clear and consistent when it comes to our policies in South China Sea. And our policies go back to 80s, when we first started building our offshore stations at the northern approaches with the foresight of our leaders, knowing that the threat is going to come from the north. We built through the 80s and 90s 5 stations at the northern fringes of South China Sea. I had the privilege to serve in 2 of them. I commanded 2 of the islands. And why South China Sea is important to us? Number one, South China Sea is what makes us a federation. As most of you might not know, we are a federation of the Peninsula, Sabah, and Sarawak and Borneo. And it's very important for us to safeguard what's happening in the South China Sea. South China Sea is also the domestic economic artery, because all our oil and gas rigs are in South China Sea. There's none in the Straits of Malacca or in the Sulu Sea. South China Sea also has a plethora of islands and rich biodiversity of the ecosystem, which provide food security, resource revenue, and whatnot for the country. So as we go along safeguarding South China Sea, the options, like I said, balancing priorities and weighing options. We employ legal options, security options, economic options. As you can see, when it comes to Straits of Malacca and Sulawesi, where non-state actors were the threat, it was easy to bring everybody together and safeguard those waters. But when you face a state-sponsored challenge, you need to combine a couple of options and look at the situation more objectively. So some of you that have been watching South China Sea and Malaysia, you will know that we have resolved a lot of sovereign rights issue with our neighbors through our economic mechanism. We've also taken our neighbors to court with regards to sovereignty, with regards to marine resources, living resources. We have made a lot of enforcement activities, and in fact, we busted a neighboring illegal fishing syndicate, which resulted in the issuance of a EU yellow card. But when it comes to oil and gas, we are very particular. We need to be careful. As I mentioned earlier, that that is the economic artery of the country. The options that we have must be employed accordingly. As the foreign minister mentioned, we have been clear and consistent so far in the way we have undertaken our options. So as Greg mentioned just now, we did not back down, no matter what. For us, it's a sovereign rights issue, which we are quite familiar with our neighbors. But here we are dealing with someone who claims to be our neighbor. So, and a power. And we are quite familiar with superpower rivalry since the Second World War, and the HMS Prince of Wales and Repulse, stark reminder with their graves in the South China Sea of superpower rivalry, and we don't want any repeat of that. So we want to actually maintain these existing processes that we have in the region, our diplomatic efforts to continue to pursue amicable and peaceful resolution to South China Sea. As Greg mentioned also, that Hayang DZ8's second show in the region after Vietnam was responded, the first show was responded by immense platforms from Vietnam. For us, there is no need, because we have not lost anything. It was a survey, and our priority right now is the pandemic. We are observing this survey with a small number of our assets. We have our own processes to deal with this. We don't need a megaphone diplomacy. At the end of the day, it is trying to resolve this issue. But then there will be quarters who will ask, where is the red line? When will the red line be crossed? That we leave it to the processes of diplomacy and not gunboat diplomacy to resolve this issue. So talking about friends coming from afar, assisting, we thank you so much for being there, and they are still, some of them are still there, observing the social distancing at sea. I would suggest that let's maintain the social distance and not create any more friction, and ensure that South China Sea will continue to be the sea of prosperity and not sea of adversity. So as I mentioned in the beginning, there's a need for us to look at several options when dealing with issues like this. It should be long-term. We should not be hasty in dealing with issues. Insofar as Malaysia is concerned, Malaysia has been quite successful in safeguarding our interests in South China Sea. Although we have addressed almost all issues in the South China Sea with regards to our neighbors. Some of our neighbors have acted unilaterally in safeguarding their maritime interests. That is because they have balanced their priorities and weighed their options. So likewise, we too need to balance our priorities and weigh our options. With that, thank you very much.
Thanks, Martin. So there you go, two very illuminating presentations that I think have placed the very difficult issues in context. In the interest of time, we are going to collect 2 comments or questions per round before we turn back to our speakers. If you have a question or a comment, please use the raise hand function. Let me first ask the let me ask the first question, and then I'm going to pick one from those who have raised their hands. And I'd like to address my question to Martin. I understand that Malaysia may be weighing its options and priorities in the South China Sea. But statements from top Malaysian leaders for some time now have been described by many observers as false equivalence, trying to equate US exercise of freedom of the seas with Chinese assertiveness as if they are both equally at fault for the rising tensions in the South China Sea. Do Malaysians think that US activities in the South China Sea contribute to the rise in tension? And if yes, do you want American warships to leave the South China Sea and stop freedom of navigation exercises and other activities? That's number one. And number two question, your previous Prime Minister Mahathir Mohamad said some intriguing things that has something to do with Malaysian policy towards the South China Sea. I'm not going to quote him. Instead, I'm just going to show you a very brief video clip. Take a listen.
We have to accept the fact that China is a big power. You know, the Malay states have existed near China for the past 2,000 years. We have survived because we know how to conduct ourselves. We don't go around trying to be aggressive when we don't have the capacity. So we use other means. In the past, we used to send to China gold and silver flowers every year as a symbol of our being practically subservient to them.
So there you go. Is Malaysia subservient to China on the South China Sea issue? I mean, is that a widely shared view among the defense and foreign policy establishment there in Malaysia, or was that just Mahathir being Mahathir and we shouldn't bother with him because he's no longer prime minister? So two questions there for you, Martin. And then let me choose one from those who have raised their hands. John Barnett?
It's actually two questions. The first question is, it's my understanding that the United States Navy has been doing naval exercise in the area, and I could be wrong on this, for the last 2 years. We haven't discussed that. Also, the other thing that has been in the news quite a bit is the Chinese carrier that it's the Russian made one that's also been in the area too. Has that been an issue too? And then I'm going to ask a similar question when I asked with the first one. I'm curious, why isn't ASEAN as a whole, why everyone is not telling China you can't do this?
So the first question is on US-China rivalry in the South China Sea. No, we are friends to all, foes to none when it comes to our foreign policy. We know that the South China Sea has been sort of a playground for powers, and they have patrolled and conducted exercises for decades in the South China Sea, and so many operations. And yet we do not make much fuss about it. But when it comes to issues regarding ASEAN, we have the ASEAN-China Joint Working Group on the Declaration of Conduct of Parties. And as you all know, that this forum has been used to, is actually the medium where they are discussing about the code of conduct, the eventful code of conduct, and hoping that the code of conduct will bring some sort of resolution to the South China Sea. But I believe foreign powers have their own agenda on their own, just like us. They have their own balanced priorities. They balance their own priorities and have their own options to undertake their own foreign policy. We are not bothered with that. As much as we are concerned, don't use our Malaysian waters as a playground for rivalry, because South China Sea, like I said, is quite sensitive when it comes to conflict or some friction. If it happens, that's because if we have a deep water horizon issue in the South China Sea, you can imagine the disaster on the ecosystem. that will happen, and who is going to be cleaning up this whole waterway, sea column, if that happens. So we got to be careful when dealing with powers. We have conducted a lot of exercises with China and also United States, and we have annual bilateral events. We work very closely with all these nations. We have Navy ships from China. We have a surveillance system from the United States. We have law enforcement vessels from Japan, Australia. So we actually have, we don't have a military pact or trade pact with anybody. So this way, we safeguard maritime interests on our own. As what Jeff mentioned, Greg mentioned just now. So far, we have not backed down. Yes, there have been a lot of patrols here and there, but they have not disturbed our production. This is just exploration. We are not extracting anything. It was just a kind of a survey, underground survey, which we will have to bring back. And this was done by our own company, not a foreign company, Petronas, Fortune 500 company, which has got many oil and gas interests around the world. And most of the Petronas interests are actually outside the country. So Petronas is well versed with dealing on sovereign rights. So we leave it at sovereign rights issues. So there's no threat to sovereignty as such. Now, from the statements of leaders, I think we got to not just take the end part of what Dr. Mahathir said. We also have to take the earlier part of what he said, that we have survived this long through our diplomacy. We have. If he says we were subservient, yes, he's talking about those days when the Malay states were ruled by kings and all that. But at those states, the China of today is not the China of yesterday. So we used to send tributes to them when we were an empire. We were a great empire for 600 years. Those who have dealt with Southeast Asian history will know the Srivijayan Empire and the Silent Empire of the Javanese. So the India-China trade was flourishing at that time. And these empires were part of that flourishing trade well before the advent of Western powers coming and colonizing Southeast Asia. So he was referring to that. But today is a different ballgame altogether. We are all sovereign states. We need to safeguard our sovereignty, our sovereign rights. One of the winners of those against those colonial attempts was Thailand. Thailand was never colonized. That was because Thailand balanced their priorities and weighed their options in ensuring that it remained an uncolonized state. So I hope these two answers that first question. And then comes ASEAN. There are only 4 claimant states. There are 10 members in ASEAN. So only 4 claimant states. So as far as claimant states are concerned, we have been raising this issue since the 2002 Declaration of Conduct of Parties, and of course the 2009 9-dash line and all that. So a number of meetings, a number of discourses has taken place. But yes, rest assured that ASEAN has raised this issue in many of their communiques. And as far as we are concerned, we want to approach this matter amicably and peacefully. And we want to look at long-term effects, long-term goals, instead of hastily resorting to action, reaction, and then losing out. As far as I'm concerned, the South China Sea is just like the COVID-19 pandemic. You know, the virus actually starts here on the north, and then it goes down to your respiratory organs. So the South China Sea is actually affected in the north. So what's happening in the south is also actually symptomatic to our failures in addressing China in the north. Has the international community addressed this issue well before, we would not have all these installations up in the north and affecting things down south. So we are down here now. We are addressing this issue. But in any case, there's always time. As far as we are concerned, we use this time to ensure that we get our act together and put our options to a more fruitful and long-term advantage for us and for the rest of our neighbors.
Okay, do you want me to take one of the questions, Jeff? I'll yeah. So let me start with the U.S. military piece, right? So, very broadly, of course, the U.S. has been conducting military activities in the South China Sea for years. Under the Trump administration, it's been well documented that the pace of so-called freedom of navigation operations is well up, about once every 6 weeks. There have been 3 so far this year. 4 maybe. It's unclear if the Berries passage past Periscope was actually a distinct FONOP. But FONOPs are a very tiny part of what the U.S. does, right? So there's a U.S. Navy ship in the South China Sea every single day, more than one, and they're operating in the high seas. And with the exception of the economic rights guaranteed by UNCLOS and the EEZ, the waters we're talking about are high seas. The U.S. has every right to sail through it, as does, the Australian Navy, the JMSDF, the British, the French, everybody else who operates out there. Now, I mean, respectfully, what I did just hear from Martin was the same false equivalency that we're talking about, the sense that the U.S. does it and China does it. The U.S. is bad and China's bad, or the U.S. is good and China's good. And the fact is that a Chinese survey vessel, the high end rate, is operating illegally, period. I don't care what the current, was it the deputy head of MMEA who came out and said that they're not doing anything wrong? Of course they are. They're conducting a commercial survey on Malaysia's continental shelf. That is illegal. It is illegal under UNCLOS. A U.S. Navy ship sailing through the South China Sea is not illegal under UNCLOS, and neither is any of the other activities that the United States does in the South China Sea. Whether or not Malaysia wants to speak up more forcefully, that's Malaysia's choice. If Malaysia believes that quiet diplomacy and government-to-government relations can smooth this out, fine. That's Malaysia's prerogative. The U.S. does not think that that's going to work, and neither does Vietnam, and neither does any Filipino not named Rodrigo Duterte, and neither do the Australians or the Japanese or the British or the French or a whole lot of other people who are getting louder and louder about what China's doing. Nobody's going to force KL to take a stronger position here, but it is, I do think it is unhelpful, and it is absolutely fair for people to get irritated when they hear Mahathir or former Deputy Minister Liu Chentong basically say that a Chinese Coast Guard patrol of Laconia Shoals is no different than a U.S. Navy ship sailing through international waters. That is an absurd position for any official to take in any country. And then quickly on the ASEAN point, look, as Martin said, there's only 4 claimants, 5 if you count Indonesia on the fishing side. Of the others, Singapore is broadly interested in international law. Thailand is broadly interested in avoiding conflict. The other 4 just don't want to talk about the issue. You're never going to get the Cambodians or the Laos or the Burmese to talk about the South China Sea in any way that's going to upset China. And so ASEAN is not equipped to deal with this issue. The code of conduct is not going to deal with this issue. The only 2 options are a bad code of conduct or no code of conduct at all. That's the only 2 options on the table. It's the only 2 options that have been on the table since 1998 when these negotiations started. And the current draft code of conduct, all the positions put forward from the Southeast Asians, including the Malaysian draft and the Philippine draft and the Vietnamese draft, which are the most forward-leaning, are basically the same draft they put forward 25 years ago. And they already lost these arguments with China then. And now they're having them again with a stronger China who's even less willing to compromise. So if we continue to believe that ASEAN is the savior here, we're going to do 2 things. We're going to guarantee the South China Sea becomes a Chinese lake, and we're going to fracture ASEAN, because the claimant states will not put up with this forever. In particular, the claimant states to the north, the Vietnamese and the Filipinos, who take most of the lumps, are not going to put up with the idea that they have to keep their heads down and let the code of conduct sell their rights forever.
All right, for the attendees, please identify yourself before you comment or ask questions. Yuan Graham and Bob Guerrier.
Hello, everyone. Ewan Graham from the IISS Asia. I have, thank you both for your presentations. 2 questions directed to Greg. One, Greg, you said that CNNOC is likely to be moving towards a model where they are the only company that can drill commercially in the south of the South China Sea. Do you see that being on a unilateral model, or is China more interested in coercing the Southeast Asian littoral states into a joint development model for political reasons? And the second question, in your presentation, you showed an interesting graphic that revealed the Chinese survey vessel has been operating across into the Bruneian EEZ. We haven't talked about Brunei yet, but what do you think is the Chinese motivation there? Clearly, it wasn't accidental. And what do you think will be the Bruneian response?
Thank you for both the speakers, both of your presentations. A comment and a quick question. I think, Gregory, you made a very clear, lucid point that Chinese activities are the very essence of coercion, essentially preventing nations' rights to develop their own EEZs, de facto or otherwise, in their actions. And in response to this, my observation is that the US, as it has for decades, sent ships to occupy space in the South China Sea to exercise their international rights to challenge essentially the unilateral acts of one country, China, that are denying others. So my point of this is the acts of the US are acts that seek to uphold the universality of international law. It applies globally. And so my question is simply, and this is really for Captain Sebastian, do you support the idea that there should be a different standard in the South China Sea? And if you do, isn't that the certain road to hegemony by China that'll subjugate those nations that have rights to explore and exploit their own EEZs? Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. I think I'll allow Greg to answer Ewan Graham's question first, then I shall take on Bob's question.
Okay. Yeah, give me the easy ones, Martin.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Well, so on CNOOC, I think that the Chinese model is to make it, as I said, prohibitively expensive, prohibitively risky to continue to unilaterally explore and exploit if you're not in partnership with CNOOC. So the preference is going to be, as has been evident in China's language about third parties in the draft COC, which I'll point out China also included in their draft COC in 1998. It's not a new position. If you're Petronas, you can either drill with CNOOC or you cannot drill at all. That's the position. I don't expect that that's going to translate into unilateral Chinese drilling. It will translate into more unilateral Chinese exploration. I think we're going to see the Haiyang Di and its sister ships called out a whole lot more. And I will point out that they've been operating a lot more the last 2 years. We've documented operations by multiple Chinese survey ships doing hydrographic surveys. They don't usually get this much attention, but actual exploitation is another matter. One of the dirty little secrets I think about South China Sea hydrocarbons is that China's never been all that interested in getting them for itself anyway. It talks a big game, but at the end of the day, except for the stuff just south of China on what would be China's continental shelf, there's really no economically viable way for China to exploit them. There's not enough oil. Most of it's natural gas, and any oil you did pull up would go on the same spot market as anything else. So it's not like CNOOC gets a better deal for selling very difficult to get to South China Sea oil. For the natural gas, it's only valuable to the closest state. China's not going to run a 1,000-mile pipeline to the coast of China to produce natural gas across very difficult terrain in the face of competing claims. You could talk about LNG, but you're not going to be able to liquefy it and then compete on price. So unless Malaysia gets that gas, nobody's going to get that gas. Same goes for the Vietnamese at Nam Can San and the Filipinos at Reed Bank. It's either they get it and it goes and gets processed on shore at the nearest point, or it doesn't get processed at all. And China seems to be perfectly happy with the idea that it doesn't get processed at all. That's fine, as long as the Malaysians and the Filipinos and the Vietnamese can't have it. On Brunei, I'm honestly not sure why. So the Haiyang Di survey did start in Bruneian waters. It left fairly quickly thereafter, came back a couple times, but for the most part, it started and then headed to Malaysia. I really don't know why that is. Brunei is always pretty quiet on this. There's a lot of chatter about the various deals that CNPC have talked about on the refining side, but there's been no actual movement toward joint development from Brunei. And Brunei's slow walked the Chinese for almost a decade now on this talk of joint development. Maybe this was a subtle message to Brunei that they don't get a pass forever, that Malaysia might be a target now, but Brunei is not going to be left out.
Thanks, Greg. I think Greg explained it very well. When you talk about sovereign rights, you actually need to know about this extraction and the whole process of it. But when talking about hegemony, China hegemony, coercion and all that, we need to also look back. This is not the first incident that we've had China so-called intimidating us and all that. We've had before at F-14 and at Sapura Esperanza, as what Greg mentioned just now, but we are producing. There's production going on there. There was some harassment, yes, but as Greg mentioned, they did not disturb the actual production. Some harassment on moving about, maybe some crazy commanding officer on a Coast Guard a vessel, but no, they have not disturbed our production. And so insofar as we are concerned, our sovereign rights have not been disturbed. But when you look at that right now, what's going on in South China Sea, you cannot make that assumption that we are allowing China's hegemony in the South China Sea. We are just exercising our option. So when you talk about sovereign rights, we are also talking about living resources. We have caught Chinese vessels. We have charged them in court, Chinese fishing vessels. We've done it. Not only just Chinese, the Vietnamese, the Thais. Right now, we are conducting major operation of Naga for illegal fishing on the east coast of, whilst we are shadowing this activity on oil and gas, we are also conducting major activity in illegal fishing, and we are also shadowing Chinese vessels of Luconia, as was mentioned in the earlier slides. So it's not that we are giving a free ticket to anybody. It's just our way of doing things. And we have been doing it in a very clear and consistent fashion, as what the Foreign Minister mentioned in his statement. And we will continue to do so unless the time comes that we forgo, I mean, we have exhausted all avenues. So Greg mentioned legal, option. Yes, someone has crossed the line. Yes, but we have been talking about legal options since the beginning of the building up of the installations up north. Nothing has happened. The 8 installations have come up. We've talked about economic, we've talked about diplomatic, but we couldn't stop all those military installations. So we need another approach to handle it in our side, our neck of the woods, I would say. So what role then superpowers in safeguarding as a guardian of peace? For me, I would propose that superpowers best be the stewards of peace, the shepherds of peace. Let the flock decide what they want to do. Eventually, the shepherd will still be there to safeguard peace. Not to take leadership of the region, but to be a steward and a shepherd of peace. In case the flock is threatened and all options have been exhausted and nothing can be done, that's where I feel that the steward and the shepherd has their role to play. And in this case, a role hopefully will not lead to long-term consequences in the region. Thank you.
Chris Chung and Kentaro Furuya Sensei. Chris, go ahead, please.
Hi, name is Chris Chung, PhD candidate in history at the University of Toronto, Canada. I had a question for Greg. Do you see any sort of pattern between kind of like the locations of where these Chinese surveys are done, and for instance, kind of like following the U-shaped lines, kind of rough outer edges, or maybe you don't. For instance, if you've seen like activities in portions where they're quite far from any claimed features, or rather that you see them only being close by claimed features, or I don't know. So that's my question. Thanks.
Yes, good morning to you and to everybody from Tokyo. My name is Commander Kentaro Furuya. I'm adjunct professor at the GRIPS and the Japan Coast Guard Academy. Thank you very much for your informative presentation, Greg and Martin. I have two questions for each of you. First of all, Greg, recently, news resources revealed that the coronavirus threat is not only on territory, but also in aircraft carrier, for example, Theodore Roosevelt, US Navy aircraft carrier. And then the report said that the reduction of the US naval presence in the South China Sea. What do you think? Is there influential to Chinese Coast Guard or Chinese Navy's activity in South China Sea? That's my question. And Mr. Martin, you mentioned that sometimes you may need to bring a Navy to balance to counter Chinese assertive activities. Chinese naval activities. What do you think if you bring, for example, Malaysian Royal Navy to the scene, would it escalate the situation at sea? That's my question. Thank you very much.
I think let's go to Greg first. Greg?
You get to answer the best questions.
All right, yeah. I have to wait for the host to unmute me, so there's that awkward moment where I'm, silent on the screen. Chris, I'm familiar with your work. It's great to meet. I guess this is meeting these days. The survey question is an interesting one. We just published a report last month, mid-April, on Chinese survey activity, not just China's, but all foreign survey activity outside of coastal EEZs. So all U.S. activity outside of the U.S. EEZ, all Chinese activity outside of the Chinese EEZ. Of course, China had the most, as you'd expect. What's interesting about China's activity is everybody else's, you can pretty much tell what they're doing, right? A military survey is a military survey, a commercial survey is a commercial survey, marine scientific research is marine scientific research. And it's pretty easy to tell, including with the U.S. fleet. The Chinese intentionally make that difficult. And so you can tell when something's moving in a lawnmower pattern. They're clearly doing some hydrographic surveys that could be either military or commercial, but the same boats are going to do both, right? The same boats are engaging in military surveys for the PLAN and engaging in the kind of surveys that we're seeing right now and engaging in MSR. So most of the survey activity we see is actually taking place in places like the Western Pacific, just on the other side of the Bashi Channel, or in Micronesia, on the other side of the Malacca Strait, and around the southern Andamans, places where you expect China to want to break through the first island chain. And they clearly want to be able to run their subs effectively. In the South China Sea, I don't see much pattern at all. Now, you have the instances like this with the Haeundae Strait and like the one off Vietnam last year, where you can tell that they're sending a message, right? In this case, they very closely follow the borders of Malaysia EEZ. They've crossed over into the JDA with Vietnam a couple times, but they've very clearly tried to send a message to Malaysia. Last year, they very clearly followed the boundaries of their own oil and gas blocks that CNOOC had declared in 2012 to send a message to Vietnam that we own this. But the rest of it is kind of all over the place. It's not necessarily just within the 9-dash line. And I've had discussions with Chinese officials where they're very coy about whether or not they claim oil and gas rights beyond the 9-dash line. I mean, if they're claiming full 200 nautical mile EEZs and continental shelves from all 4 of the island groups, the CSIS, then that gets you a lot more than the 9-dash line. And for instance, ExxonMobil's project, the Blue Whale Field, is about 20 miles outside of the 9-dash line, but within a Chinese continental shelf claim from the Paracels. Chinese are very coy about whether or not they'd objected to that. So, I mean, that's a long way of saying I don't think you can read anything in to the patterns. I expect you're going to see Chinese survey activity everywhere within the South China Sea, 9-dash line or no, and sometimes it'll be actual surveys, and sometimes it'll be the equivalent of a middle finger to the coastal states. Yeah. And then on the question about Chinese readiness, I've gotten this question a lot lately, right? We've been hit hard at sea, so has the PLAN or the CCG been hit hard at sea? And I don't know that anybody can answer the question. I mean, the activities of, obviously, day-to-day operations of the PLAN and the CCG are much more a black box than those of the US Navy or the JMSDF. Chinese ships are not doing a whole lot of foreign port calls. They're not engaging in a lot of defense diplomacy. If you sail out of a Chinese port and then you sail back into a Chinese port and you never go anywhere else, how do we know if the ship is understaffed or half of the crew are ill? I can say that I haven't seen any numerical drop in numbers of deployments of CCG and PLAN, but that's not the same thing. And China, as far as I know, officially, China still maintains that not a single PLA personnel was stricken with COVID, which seems mathematically impossible. So your guess is as good as mine.
So Kentaro, very apt to ask that question with regards to pandemic and asset readiness with regards to the infections on board. As we all have seen and heard about the infection on an aircraft carrier, and that is already one aircraft carrier out of operations for that short period. So likewise, as I mentioned earlier in my presentation, it's all about balancing priorities and weighing options. For us, it was sovereign rights versus lives and livelihood. So lives, we have to make sure we seal our borders, and we have long borders in the Straits of Malacca. If those who have been watching how our Navy ships been deployed, you would have seen that 4 of our frigates were actually in the Straits of Malacca, covering and sealing the maritime borders. And you know, we have seamless maritime waterways, undulating and long coastlines which are porous, and also proximity and porosity of these coastlines are not easy tasks for the security agencies. So in combination with the military and law enforcement assets, we have deployed them throughout the Sulu Sea and also the Straits of Malacca to ensure that we don't have infected influx of migrants coming in and making things worse. So far, I think we've been quite successful in addressing this issue through the movement restriction and through the deployment of military and law enforcement agencies to address safety of lives and also continue the business enterprises to address livelihood. Slowly we are opening up and also making sure that this crew of security agencies that are operating out will not be infected because we don't have much assets. We have raised this issue on assets and we are getting those assets in due time. But until then, I think we have balanced our priorities in addressing during this pandemic season, addressing maritime security gaps and ensuring that we look at our priorities first. And from there, we weigh our options. How do we deal with the threats that we are facing? Can we wait? Can we use other options to deal with things that are of less priority at the moment? Talking about deploying military vessels, and yes, we are. The Air Force is constantly doing their patrols and watching and conducting surveillance. Of course, there will be an ASEAN forum and ASEAN-led forum with China, and this will be raised. All these issues will be raised, and let diplomacy take its course and address these issues amicably. So I think there is still a chance for us to continue discussions. As I said, this is no time to be hasty. We need to ensure that we don't go through the arms race by pushing the envelope too much. And then, as we all know, because of this pandemic, a bad economic forecast is looming. We've got to be very sure where the money is spent. We've got to be prudent so that it does not go for more security spending and less for socioeconomic needs. So these priorities and options need to be balanced. Thank you.
All right, we have less than 15 minutes left. So I guess 2 more rounds of very brief questions and then we're gonna end. Robert Beckman and Hunter Martin.
Thank you. Robert Beckman here. Good morning to all of you from Singapore, and special hello to Martin, an old friend from Malaysia. I just have one quick question, and that is that it's my understanding that from the map that Greg put up, that the Petronas site was actually not in Malaysia's economic zone, but it was in the area of the joint extended continental shelf submission that Malaysia made together with Vietnam in May of 2009. And can he confirm that? And then I guess I would ask, was this drilling therefore done with the consent and permission of Vietnam, who you would be sharing sovereign rights with until you resolve any boundary in this joint submission area?
Hunter, go ahead, please.
Hi, thank you. Hunter Marston, I'm a PhD candidate at the Australian National University. There's been speculation for years about Vietnam filing a arbitration like the Philippines has, and I wonder what the speaker's views would be on that. Would it give ballast to other ASEAN disputants, or would it be controversial, perhaps? Thanks.
Well, thanks for the question, Bob. So you're right. The as far as we can tell, all 4 of the wells that the West Capella, the drilling rig, drilled are in the joint development area. It's possible that one of them might be just at the limits of the Malaysian continental shelf, but clearly the Vietnamese are angry. The Vietnamese deployed their fishing militia by the first week of January, and they've been on station warding away the West Capella, and obviously not engaged in the same kind of high seas game of chickens the Chinese are, but trying to assert that the Malaysians need to go home. The explanations that I've heard are basically that, and I think the explanation that Petronas used to sell this idea is that the joint defined area is not a joint development area, and that Malaysia did not explicitly agree to forego unilateral oil and gas exploration in the 2009 submission. The 2009 submission merely said that both sides recognized that they had a dispute and would eventually need to delimit it. Now, I think for everybody else who's not a Petronas executive, this seems like a violation of the spirit, if not the word, of the 2009 agreement. And certainly that's the way the Vietnamese feel about it. And to Hunter's question, I mean, yeah, there's a lot of chatter. I was at the Diplomatic Academy of Vietnam's conference in the fall. Bob was there. I think Martin was there. I mean, they had 3 presidents or vice presidents of ITLOS there. The message was very clearly that Hanoi is hotly debating the idea of bringing a case. I was also at the DAV conference in Da Nang in 2014 during the Hainan Sharia 981 standoff, when they also had this debate. So I'm skeptical. I'm especially skeptical this year, right? Vietnam has the ASEAN chair. They're dealing with COVID-19 now as the ASEAN chair. They have a party leadership transition coming up next year at the National Party Congress. It's an extremely sensitive time to launch an effort like this. I don't think it's going to happen unless they feel like they've really been shoved into a corner with no other options. And so, if we see more incidents like we saw in the Paracels last month, and we end up with dead Vietnamese sailors in the water, yeah, maybe that changes things. Otherwise, I expect that that the Vietnamese are going to use the threat of arbitration as a useful lever in party-to-party discussions, but they're not going to actually pull that lever unless they feel that they've got no other options left.
Yes, hi Bob. It's been quite some time that I heard you. Yes, these are sovereign rights issue. Like I mentioned earlier in my we've got wide experiences when it comes to sovereign rights issues with our neighbors. We have the JDA, Joint Development Area with Thailand. We've had before Joint Commercial Area with Vietnam. And this activity is also a sovereign rights issue with the neighbors. So there are other platforms or rather the existing platforms where neighbors can discuss. But this is completely different issue. This is an issue that we are looking at profiteering from pandemic. So I will say taking the opportunity of the pandemic to exercise some excessive action, but it can wait. For us, our action will be through diplomatic channels. And we will, as Greg mentioned, Vietnam is ASEAN chair, and whatever issues that Vietnam has with the neighbors and all that will be raised in the next ASEAN meeting, which may convene soon as the COVID pandemic is over, and let the process go through. There's no need for gunboat diplomacy. There's no need for everybody to gather at one place and allow friction someday to escalate the situation. So let diplomacy prevail.
All right. Last round of questions. Mike Perrin and then Mataki Kamiya. Mike, go ahead, please.
Yeah, it's a question to Martin along the lines of what he was talking about, the HMS repulse in Prince of Wales. These are shipwrecks in the Malay area. And I think I've given the question last month to Gregory along those lines, but I'll get into more detail on this one. I'm Mike Perrin. I'm the education director at YCAPS in Yokosuka, and I'm an adjunct lecturer at the National Defense Academy in Japan. And I'm also doing a PhD. I'm a PhD candidate with Oxford's Maritime Archaeology Center. But the question is, along the lines of China's sort of using underwater archaeology and shipwrecks as a sort of an excuse to make claims on the South China Sea. So this all started in 2013 when Liu Shuguang of China's Center for Underwater Cultural Heritage said, I'll quote, "We want to find more evidence that can prove Chinese people went there and lived there, historical evidence that can help prove China is the sovereign owner of the South China Sea," end quote. This is a clear agenda of using underwater cultural heritage to claim the South China Sea. But obviously, as anybody knows, there are a variety of countries and culture shipwrecks and maritime cultural heritage underwater in the South China Sea. Now, China's been aggressively using this since that statement in 2013. And like Greg was saying, on a geopolitical scale, since 2017, this has jacked up considerably. And we see it in the establishment of maritime archaeology bases in the South China Sea. There's a considerably large-sized base under the auspices of, underwater cultural heritage in Hainan now. And the use of massive research ships now. It started with the Kaogu 1 back in 2014, and the actions in the disputed waters around the Philippines that the Chinese military has used in these disputed waters against French archaeologists who were doing a project in the Philippines under Philippine auspices. Now, the 2001, this is the last statement on it, the 2001 UNESCO Convention on Underwater Cultural Heritage basically forbids this kind of aggressive activity. But maybe more directed at Martin, but Martin at the beginning said he wanted us to go easy on the questions. Don't want to put him on the spot too much. I was just going to say that, but Malaysia, as well as most Southeast Asian countries, have not signed on to this convention on underwater cultural heritage, which would really aid in deterring aggressive Chinese actions with regard to these archaeological claims for geopolitical claims on the South China Sea. So Martin, why do you think Malaysia didn't sign on to this UNESCO Convention on Underwater Cultural Heritage? And to keep you off the spot, instead of Malaysia, why do you think Southeast Asian nations in general haven't signed on?
Matake Kamiya-san, go ahead, please.
Thank you very much. I'm Matake Kamiya, Professor of International Relations at the National Defense Academy of Japan. Thank you for two great presentations. My question is a very basic one to Captain Sebastian. Martin, you said that Malaysia and the ASEAN wants to solve the South China Sea issue amicably. And I understand it's a part of the ASEAN way. But China seems to be enhancing its attempt to deal with the South China Sea issue through non-amicable, unilateral, sometimes even coercive ways. In the face of such a reality, does Malaysia, or does ASEAN still say that the issue should be solved by amicable ways? Do you think such an approach can be successful vis-a-vis China? Thank you very much.
Yes, so Mike's question about history and claims and all that, we have made a very firm stand on the 9-line claims. That's well recorded. There's no point talking about history in the South China Sea. As I mentioned earlier, we were a great empire, maritime empire for 600 years, and so was Indonesia, and so was the Khmer Empire. So can you imagine how the Khmer Empire, the Srivijayan Empire, and all that were moving that time, not by road, but also by sea. If you go to Borobudur today, you will see a replica, or rather a carving of the Silent ships at that time. But we don't claim South China Sea as such. If we were to say that everybody want to talk about historical claim, then we need to surrender China to Mongolia, because Kublai Khan also ruled China from Mongolia. So, I mean, we can't go back to history. We have to go to now the rule of law and state our stand to safeguard sovereignty and sovereign rights. But how you do it is another thing. You need to use several options when you deal. There's no clear path that you should take. As I mentioned, there's no need for megaphone diplomacy. You don't need to publicize and tell everybody how you want to do it. It's up to you how you safeguard your own interests. So Yes. Talking about signatory of this and that, we are not a signatory to the Refugee Convention, but we have housed the Vietnamese refugees in the island. We've given refugees from Mindanao a home. We have been catering for the Rohingyas and the refugees from the Middle East and war-torn countries and all that in Malaysia. Signing, the country might have their own reasons for not signing conventions, but they know exactly why they have not signed for certain reasons best known to them, and also what how this will constitute to signing or not signing conventions will constitute to safeguarding our own maritime interests. To Kamiya-san, your question on ASEAN Way. ASEAN, good discussion forum, yes, but many of the members have taken unilateral action on safeguarding their interests. Look at Indonesia, for example. Look at how they deal with their fisheries. Look at how they handle the Chinese when it comes to encroachment of fishing vessels and intrusion of government vessels. And just like us, how do we handle issues that require very fine tuning of approaches when we talk about fisheries, offshore oil and gas, movement of superpowers in our EZ, you know. So I go back to what I have been driving at, balancing priorities. You need to balance your priorities, and you have to weigh the options that you take when addressing issues that you think are of concern for the nation. In that way, we don't need to be a client state, or we have never been subservient to anybody. We've been a very strong voice in the United Nations, 4 times in the rotating members of the Security Council. We've spoken about, and we've been facilitators for Mindanao and Bangladesh and Palestine. So we are not a weak voice. We will stand up when the time comes. And if a legal option need to be taken, we will take it. But where we think that we can balance our priorities quite well, we will exercise our options accordingly. Thank you.
Well, I don't have a whole lot to add. I will just piggyback on the history point a little bit. You know, in large part, the contest for the South China Sea is a contest over the narrative. Beijing trying to convince the rest of the world of the fairy tale it has already told itself, which is the antiquity of its claims to the land features, and since the 1990s, the antiquity of its control over the waters. The decision to, effectively ban underwater archaeology by any other coastal state is meant to further that narrative. And the best thing that Southeast Asian, archaeologists and history professors could do to counter that would be to focus on the actual history of the South China Sea, which is that it was used by everybody. It was a busy artery of trade and fishing and exploration by Malay traders and Cham traders and Indians and Arabs, and yes, from time to time, Chinese. And that, effectively undermines the Chinese narrative of exclusive control. Otherwise, what we end up with is, the situation in which people can't make up their minds because China muddies the water. It spreads so much misinformation and conspiracy theories, and it does so in such volume, right? It's pumping out more international law and maritime law and history PhDs than everybody else combined, and they flood the airwaves with their alternative history of the South China Sea. That pushback needs to be concerted. It's not going to work if it's by individual states.
All right. Thank you very much. Very interesting discussions. We still have many raised hands. Unfortunately, we ran out of time. So again, thanks to our speakers for the time and expert insights. I'm turning over to my boss, Bob Gillier, for some closing remarks. Bob?
I'm Bob Gillier, President Pacific Forum. I apologize for not introducing myself earlier. I just wanted to thank both speakers really for your time today. Gregory, your work with AMTI, you shine a bright light on this activity. It's vital. It's so important. Your website's illuminating. And again, it has increased the knowledge level of so many people. And in this battle of the narrative that you talk about, keeping track of the facts is very, very important. So I thank you and your organization for that service. Capt. Martin, Sebastian, again, thank you for your time today. The coastal state perspectives, and your vital interest, it's clearly central in these issues and in this whole discussion. And I think your comment about superpowers should be stewards of peace, stewards and shepherds is a wonderful ideal. It makes us question what happens when that conduct does not occur, when all great powers aren't acting in that way. So a final summary note from my perspective from hearing this wonderful exchange. There's friction, to be sure, in the South China Sea. Writ large over time, with the rammings, the harassment, the sinkings, this is all clearly occurring. And the more people understand what's happening through this dialogue, through your sites, through your work, your publishing, the more transparent and the less gray zone it becomes, these types of activities that China has engaged in. And people understand that it's very much out of step with international law and norms. And I think that's very helpful in focusing the immediacy of this issue and the need to marshal all means to address it, as I think both speakers have said. So a final thank you. It's a pleasure to co-host these maritime series with YCAPS. And with no further ado, gentlemen, thank you very much for your time.
All right, thank you very much. See you all again. Stay tuned for Maritime Discussion Series number 4 later this month. Mahalo. Goodbye for now.
Terima kasih from Kuala Lumpur.
Thank you, everybody.